I'm here with Michelle Laurent, our medical doctor and also obstetrician from France. And it's really difficult to choose which questions to ask this man who is probably the one that has seen the most in childbirth of anyone alive today, with a perspective of studying it, of understanding childbirth, the woman, the child, our evolution and our society. So yeah, I would leave the word a bit to you to tell us a bit about where you're coming from and where you are today.
I don't want to talk too much about me,
No?
but much more what I have learned since I've been involved in childbirth. It started 1953, when I was a medical student in Paris. I spent 6 months in a maternity unit as a medical student with minor responsibilities, what is called an externe. And because I've already been involved in childbirth at that time, and although at that time I was not thinking of becoming an obstetrician, and in fact I was trained after that as a surgeon. However, I came back to obstetrics through the technique of cesarean section. So finally, I can say that since the middle of the 20th century until now, directly or indirectly, I've always been involved in childbirth, one way or another. No? And it's an interesting point to recall this date, because the middle of the 20th century has been a turning point in the history of childbirth. We might say a turning point in the history of human beings, of humanity and planet Earth in general. It has been a turning point following the big crisis that we commonly call the Neolithic Revolution, started 10,000 years ago, the time when our ancestors started to dominate nature. Before that time, our ancestors were living on a day-to-day basis, what nature can offer. They were gatherers, they were fishers, they were hunters, they were scavengers, they were living on a day-to-day basis. And suddenly, it started in different parts of the world at the same time. Suddenly, it was the beginning of the domination of nature through agriculture, animal husbandry. And it's important to realize that at the same time, some human physiological processes, particularly those related to reproduction, were suddenly also dominated, organized by the cultural milieu. It was in particular the beginning of the socialization of childbirth. Childbirth was under the control of the human group. Before that time, women just used to isolate themselves to give birth. It was like that. So from that time, we can say that gradually, birth was more and more socialized, with variants according to culture, with beliefs, rituals, but socialized one or another. And suddenly, middle of the 20th century, there has been a sudden acceleration in the history of childbirth. We might say, in general, there has been a sudden acceleration in the domination of nature by human beings. So, for example, today, geologists, those who study earth chemistry, say that a new phase in the history of the planet started at that time. they call that the Anthropocene age. It means the time when the history of earth chemistry became suddenly under influenced mostly by human activities. People, climatologists, said at the beginning of the time when we sent so much CO2 in the atmosphere, greenhouse gases influencing the climates are influenced by human activities. So it was a sudden acceleration of the domination of nature. And it was the same for childbirth. Suddenly an acceleration in the socialization of childbirth through the medicalization. Many things happened from that time. When I was a medical student, at that time, a cesarean section was exceptionally rare. It was still too risky. There was no synthetic oxytocin replacing the natural hormone. No drip with plastic tubes. So recalling that is a way to realize how quickly everything has been changing. Today, we can say that at a planetary level, the number of women who give birth to the baby and to the placenta, thanks to their natural hormones, that is to say, thanks to a kind of cocktail of hormones of love, we can say that today, this number is becoming insignificant. Today, we can say that the number of babies which are immediately after birth, colonized by a great diversity of familial microbes, this number is very small. Important because it's a time when the immune system starts to be educated by the first microbe that will colonize the body of the baby. So for childbirth and whatever the topic we consider at the present time, we have reached the limits of the domination of nature. We obviously, if we are thinking in terms of survival of mankind, we have to take another direction. We can say we are at the edge of the precipice. We cannot go on like that. We have changed our way of thinking. We need a new paradigm. So, but it's important to recall that this is the case of childbirth. Important because it means period of birth is a critical period in the formation of Homo sapiens. Important for the evolution of our species, but important to realize that it's the same, whatever the topic you consider. We have reached the limits of the domination of nature. The same for the climate, the same for the pollution of the ocean, for anything. Any topic, we have reached the limits. So that's why it's so important to enlarge the topic, to wonder how can we participate in the initiation of a necessary new awareness. To realize you need a new paradigm. It's important when thinking of the future to try to realize what we need, and we need new way of thinking, new paradigm, and important to realize that there is no paradigm shift without a language shift. So the first thing we can do, because there are a lot to do, first thing you can do is to introduce a new vocabulary as a way to introduce a new way of thinking. And I suggest that one important point would be to find a term adapted to the kind of revolution we need today. There have been the Neolithic revolution thousands of years ago. and characterized by the being of the domination of nature. If we think of the next revolution, if it happens, if humans survive long enough for that, we need a term that will be the antithesis, the opposite of domination.
Mm-hmm.
Until now, it's domination of nature. And I suggest, as a key word, thinking of the future, I suggest that we call that the symbiotic revolution. Symbiosis, symbiotic means with life, working with life. It means networking with other living creatures, starting probably with the microbes, microorganisms that are the foundation of all ecosystem. So networking and understanding the laws of nature. In practice, it means understanding physiology, for example, in order to work with them instead of neutralizing them, as we have done until now. So this is why I suggest that we give a great importance to the term that can help us to think a different way. The word symbiosis has been introduced in 1979 by scientists like Dubarry studying lichens. They said it's a lichens, L-I-C-H-E-N-S, it's a symbiosis of algae and fungi. They live together, they cooperate. But in reality, that's for the vocabulary, I think the important pioneer that now we have to rehabilitate, to reintroduce, he has been forgotten, not well known, it's the Russian thinker called Kropotkin. So forget the name if you want to.
From Russia.
From Russia,
Yeah.
yes. And he wrote an interesting book, an avant-garde book, called Mutual Help. Mutual Help, a factor of evolution. And that was really challenging the dominant way of thinking. That was around 1900. It was that's why, because it was challenging the dominant way of thinking, people didn't notice what he wrote at that time. But it was so important to explain that networking, mutual assistance, is essential in the evolution of species. It was challenging the way we had interpreted for scientific advances, for example, what we had learned from Darwin. People only remembered from Darwin the domination of species, the survival of the fittest, it was competition, survival. They only remembered that. What people remember from scientists like Pasteur, but microorganisms, understood microbes are just causes of diseases, we have to fight them, domination. So all scientific advances until that time were interpreted in the light of the dominant paradigm, domination of nature. That's why a book like that, Mutual Aid, Factor of Evolution, is really the pioneer work that we needed. We can, in retrospect, we can interpret, realize its importance. So when we say that, of course, it's a huge topic, taking another direction of way of thinking. But when we consider childbirth in particular, because it's so important for the formation of human beings, we have to start thinking of childbirth from a bacteriological perspective, because first we need to work with microbes. We need microbes. Mm-hmm. The human system of a newborn baby need microbes to be educated and so on. And if we start from that, we realize that finally what happened since the middle of the 20th century, since this sudden acceleration in domination of nature, is essential from a bacteriological and immunological perspective. Before this acceleration of the 1950s, most babies were born in a familiar environment. Bacteriologically speaking, they were born among a great variety of familiar microbes, familiar for the mother and also familiar for the newborn baby, because the human placenta is special, very effective at transferring the antibodies. So babies were born among a great diversity of familiar microbes that were starting to stimulate their immune, to educate, program their immune system. It was like that until the middle of the 20th century, until this turning point, this acceleration. And then suddenly it became different. And as everybody knows, today most women give birth in an unfamiliar bacteriological environment. And babies are not born among a great diversity of microbes with variants. But in general, they are not born in a bacteriologically familiar environment. There are extreme situations, of course. Babies born in an operating theater by cesarean section, sterile environment. Babies born exposed to antibiotics. But finally, what we realize today, when we think in terms of bacteriology, immunology, that we need a new way to classify the birth. On the one hand, birth in a familiar place. On the other hand, birth elsewhere. That's a new way to classify the birth. Mm-hmm. Important way to classify the birth. That's a way to explain this turning point, to realize the importance of this turning point. It shows that if there is such a shift in our way of thinking, if we try to say, in the case of birth, the physiological process and the birth process, and that will be a way, once more, to change completely our way of thinking. When we consider the birth process from a physiological perspective in a modern way, we can say it's an involuntary process under the control of archaic brain structures, and physiologists can tell us, in the case of an involuntary process, the point is not to try to help it, you cannot, but you can protect it against some inhibitory factor. The point is to protect an involuntary process. And in the case of birth, scientists today, physiologists, can explain what are the kind of factors a laboring woman has to be protected against. Situation that might increase the level of adrenaline, situation that might stimulate the neocortex, the thinking brain. Thinking brain must take a back seat in a woman. It's not its business. It can only the activity of the new brain, of the logical brain, of the brain of the intellect, of the neocortex, can inhibit, can make more difficult basic, vital physiological function like giving birth. So a laboring woman needs to be protected against all factors that might stimulate the thinking brain, the logical brain, the neocortex, particularly language is the enemy when giving birth, light. Today we know that melatonin, the darkness hormone, works with oxytocin, the main hormone in childbirth. They work together, and all attention enhancing situation. For example, feeling observed. When you feel observed, you stimulate your neocortex. Important not to feel observed. Perception of a possible danger, you have to pay attention. So that's what we have to understand today. It's a new way of thinking, the keyword being protection. This has to be understood at a cultural level. It's not just among those practicing in a hospital or elsewhere. It has to be understood at a cultural level, and in particular in group promoting what they call natural childbirth. There is a cultural lack of understanding of birth physiology, a deep-rooted lack of understanding of birth physiology that started a long time ago, the Neolithic Revolution, domination of nature. And at the present time, this lack of understanding of birth physiology is shared by all cultural milieux, including those who promote natural childbirth. Look at all these videos of so-called natural childbirth. What do you see? You see first that there is electric light. They don't know that light inhibits the release of melatonin, a hormone of birth. You see 3-4 people around the laboring woman watching her. That the woman feeling observed. There is a camera. That's terrible. The perception of feeling observed. Often people talk as well. So what you see on many films about what they call natural childbirth, plus a man, what you see in many films about natural childbirth is a kind of recipe for long and difficult labor. And it's really a way to illustrate the current lack of understanding of the physiological processes. So that's why it's so important today to learn about the laws of nature, to learn about physiology, to learn the birth process a different way, and to challenge our cultural conditioning, to challenge tradition. Once more, perhaps, what we can do first is to change the vocabulary. No paradigm shift without language shift, to change the vocabulary. Today the key word should be protection. Protection of involuntary process against some possible inhibitory factor. That's a new way of thinking, challenging the dominant vocabulary, always suggesting that a woman has not the power to give birth by herself. That's the dominant way of thinking. She needs some cultural interferences. So many variants of keywords, but all of them suggest focus on the active role of somebody else than the two obligatory actors in childbirth, which are mother and baby. Two obligatory actors are mother and baby, but the focus with the keywords today are always about somebody else, that somebody who has an active role, variants of helping, guiding, controlling, guiding. Whatever the cultural milieu, it's always the same. If you are in natural childbirth group, they talk about coaching. You need an expert to give birth. In medical circles, labor management. The same way of thinking. The worst, the most toxical word, probably is the word support. Labor women need support. What does it mean? She needs energy brought by somebody else. She has not the energy to give birth.
Mm.
She needs support with energy brought by somebody else. So the first thing we can do at the present time is language shift, replacing all these keywords, forgetting all these keywords, and introducing giving importance to the concept of protection of an involuntary process. So this is different ways to think of a possible advent of a new way of thinking, a new paradigm, an aspect of what we might call the symbiotic revolution, with its two facets, learning to networking with other living creatures, particularly microbes, and understanding the laws of nature and trying to work with them instead of neutralizing them. Will it happen? It's so probably that it will be the only way to prolong the survival of mankind on this planet. But we cannot say more at the present time.
When it comes to this process, it also extends to the delivery, not just of the baby, but the placenta, and to go on to the breastfeeding and so forth. What is your opinion about how we deliver the placenta, or how we should
yes,
deal
but
with
it's
the
always the
cause?
same. It's always the same. The point is to understand the laws of nature and not to neutralize them. For example, about the delivery of the placenta, the only important point is to understand that immediately after birth, if a woman has given birth by herself, there is an important interaction between mother and baby, and the mother needs the contact baby skin. She needs to see baby's eyes. She needs to smell the odor of the baby. To have immediately after birth, during the first minute following birth, the highest possible peak of oxytocin a human being can release. At that time, the mother needs the baby in the same way that it's an interaction. It's a symbiosis. The mother needs the baby, but on the condition, of course, that she's not coming back to our planet after giving birth. On the condition that she does not feel observed, that she feels free, and so on. That the room temperature of the room is adapted to the situation. So at that time, the important point, once more, if you think like physiologists, is to make possible the release of this high peak of oxytocin, which is vital, not only because oxytocin is a hormone of love, but because it's also necessary for a safe, bloodless delivery of the placenta. So, because this is not understood, at the present time, almost everywhere, it seems safer to replace this peak of natural oxytocin by an injection of synthetic oxytocin. It's necessary today. As long as we have not understood better birth physiology, is probably a way to save many lives, particularly in developing countries. It's probably safer to inject synthetic oxytocin because it will take time to understand that just after the birth, the mother needs the baby. That's not easy to understand. It's challenging thousands of years of culture. So the point is that it's incredibly difficult to challenge thousands of years of culture. For that we need the help of emerging, fast-developing scientific discipline, and we need to accept what we can learn from them. That is not easy. It will take time. But apparently it might be considered utopian, but utopian does not mean impossible.
Thank you very much. I know you probably don't get these questions so often, but what is it that inspires you to work so hard to develop also your primal health research program that you're constantly working on, and you have over 1,000 articles there about the primal history and the connection and associations that we have with our childbirth and later in life. It's an enormous work, and you've also written, I think it's 15 books now that's been translated in 23 languages. It's a lot. So what is it that inspires you every day?
Difficult to provide one simple answer to such a question. What I can say that I've always been interested in human beings. And when I was age 18, after the secondary school, what to do next? At that time, there was nothing like human sciences and so on. The best way to study human beings was to study medicine. So I studied medicine. And as a young medical student, I felt the need to be effective. At that time, the best way to be effective in the field of medicine was to be a surgeon. Yeah. At that time, there was pharmacology was not very effective, and not many useful drugs and so on. Best way to be effective was to be a surgeon. As a surgeon, it happened by chance that I had to learn the technique of cesarean section, a new technique. And when I was in Algeria in the 1950s, in the French army, during the war in Algeria, was doing emergency surgery, including cesarean section. So it happened by chance that when I was in charge of a surgical unit in a French state hospital, starting in 1962, no doctor was officially in charge of the small maternity unit. So because of my background, in fact, the two midwives were calling me when they had some problems. I found that interesting to work with them. We reconsidered everything. We often modified our way of thinking together. What happened is that when I arrived, there were 200 births a year in this small maternity unit, and gradually, because we were thinking a different way, changing everything, the environment, birthing rooms, singing during pregnancy, finally, 1977, we had reached 1,000 births a year. And I was still the only doctor, 6 midwives at that time, for 1,000 births a year. So finally, I had no time for surgery. I needed colleagues for surgery. And finally, I was spending my time in the maternity unit. But originally, I'm not an obstetrician. And after my hospital career, I also had the experience of home birth. Home birth is a good way to study, to understand better birth physiology. And I had more time also to think. When you are a practitioner in charge of a surgical unit plus 1,000 births a year, you have not plenty of time to think. So that's why it's a long story. But the point is that finally, I can say that from 1953 until now, 2016, one way or another, directly or indirectly, I've always been involved in childbirth. I've been involved in childbirth all that time. So I have my own way to understand the history of childbirth, and particularly the way this history started to accelerate, you know, in the middle of the 20th century, like all other human activities. Domination of nature started to accelerate.
I see. Thank you so much. I am so honored to have had the opportunity to speak to you and to get to know you these days together here. And thank you so very much for your time. Very good.